Can we have the lights off, if you can see? Can everybody see the screen okay? Can you guys down there see the screen? Because I'm worried about that. My name's Derek Alexander. I'm Head of Archaeology for the National Trust for Scotland. First thing I'm going to ask you all is, who's a member of the National Trust for Scotland here? Excellent. I don't want to be rude or anything, but it's all the old people. The youngsters, it's where the future is. The National Trust for Scotland is Scotland's largest conservation body. We have 76,000 hectares of ground. Let's see if this thing actually works. And about 129 different properties. And these range in chronological span from the Mesolithic through to Second World War plane crash sites. People think of the National Trust for Scotland, they don't necessarily think of archaeology. When I say I'm the head of archaeology in the Trust, it makes my mum very proud. But in fact, there's only 3 of us, and we're all speaking today. So we're out in force. I'm going to do a quick introduction about what the National Trust for Scotland is responsible for. And then I'm going to hand over to Daniel after about 5 or 10 minutes so he can talk you through a number of case studies. As I say, we are charged with basically protecting and promoting Scotland's iconic places of cultural heritage and natural heritage. And the big problem there is the balance between the two. We look after large areas of countryside, we look after vernacular buildings, we look after castles, we look after battlefields. So it's quite a range and eclectic mix of Scotland's cultural and natural heritage that we have to engage with. And archaeology plays a key part in that. The main part of archaeology in understanding what the significance of these places are, that's exactly what it's about. It's about finding out what's important and what we protect for the future, what we can hand on to future generations. So for me, archaeology is a key part to the conservation process. It's about understanding the significance and then passing that forward. So the first Archaeologists Trust started in 1993, and we now have a pretty good understanding across all of our portfolio of what we have in our care. And many of you will have been to a lot of these properties previously, and they cover the entire country. Now, that's a really bad graph, but basically, out of our 129 properties, as I say, they range in date, and we have evidence on all of those for different periods. So prehistoric stuff, as you would expect, down here we've got less evidence for. Our vast majority of material relates to the last 200, 300 years, really from the 17th, 18th, 19th and into the 20th century. If I was to put a graph up there of what Historic Scotland look after as the national agency, actually there's a lot more of their stuff down at this end here. So by nature, we are obviously very interested in the last 200, 300 years, and much of our archaeological remains date to those sort of periods. And in fact, people don't tend to think of the National Trust for Scotland as, you know, a big archaeological post-medieval archaeology grouping. But in fact, we've got some very key pieces of work that I've undertaken. We've had lots and lots of survey work done on many of our islands. So here's John Hunter's published work on the Fair Isle, and the Royal Commission have done lots of work over the years. And the excavations that they did here, Norman Emery did on Hurta, on Village Bay, and the street on St Kilda, which Craig will be talking about, really was one of the first really good sets of post-medieval publications that was available for quite a large body of material, especially going into the material culture, so going into the pottery and all the artefactual remains that are on the site. A great thing, you can actually still get copies of it online. But more recently, we've been thinking, doing a bit of navel gazing in the Trust, trying to work out exactly what we look after. And as you'll all be aware from the Scottish Archaeological Research Framework, which I'll plug out to you, they should all be aware of if you're students. It's a very good set of production publications and online material that relates to the whole chronological span of Scottish archaeology. And we had a look at what we have in our portfolio, trying to work out exactly, produce a framework internally for ourselves. What are the things that we look after, and how do we move that forward? So we've produced an internal research framework, and really just to sum up the sort of types of archaeology we look after, we're not looking after large industrial mills and coal mines and that sort of thing. That's really not. We don't actually do urban very well either. But when you pull it together, much of the sort of things that we do, Marshall, Scotland, so battlefields, we've got bits of 8 different battlefields, islands and coastal sites, So here's Mingley, estate centres, anything from medieval estate centres through to big country houses. And then landscapes or wild land. There's a bit of debate about what you call wild land in Scotland. Here's a picture of Torridon illicit whisky still. So we look after quite a range of those different types. And then finally, I would say we fall in, we also have quite an interest in vernacular buildings. If you go to the east coast of Fife, you'll see lots of blue plaques on buildings in all these coastal communities in Fife that the Trust was responsible for the conservation work of. This is the Weaver's Cottage in Kilbarchan in the High Street there. Again, quite a characteristic building of an industry that is actually largely forgotten in that part of Scotland, the handloom weaving industry, which was enormous in the 18th and 19th century and made basically towns like Kilbarchan quite wealthy in their day. So those are the different types of archaeology, and as you can see the examples that I gave you for the battlefields and for the countryside and the vernacular buildings here are all sort of from the 17th, 18th and into the 19th century. So we have quite a range of interests. So when we looked at Scarf for the modern period, and I pulled out some of the different headings, Chris wrote most of this, so the things that we're interested in, it relates to the types of buildings and properties that we have. What I'd like to pick out here is really, I suppose it's the narratives that Chris was talking about. What can trust properties contribute to the major narratives of modern Scotland? So the sort of things that we're looking at, the Reformation, industrialisation, Enlightenment, agricultural improvement, the growth of capitalism, colonialism, empire, slavery, all these other big topics are in there. And it's something that, again, we're only really just starting to get a grasp of in the National Trust, but also actually probably largely in Scotland as well in terms of the archaeology. Over the years, we've undertaken a number of projects, and Chris will be aware of having undertaken quite a lot of excavation works on the Ben Lawers Historic Landscape Project. For me, this was one of the changes in terms of scale of investigation that the Trust has undertaken in Scotland, looking at the landscape. So really of the pre- and post-improvement period from the 18th into the 19th century. And what we've got here is a landscape of change from that, different improvements. Bits of it have been preserved beautifully in terms of how things have changed from the multiple tenant farms to the individual single tenant units that were introduced at the end of the 18th century. And it's a fantastic landscape and littered with thousands of archaeological sites, literally 2,000 individual archaeological features and 300 kilometres of trackways and dikes and things that the Royal Commission all surveyed. And over the course of the project, we excavated about 80 different trenches across the landscape. And it's now, the good thing is about all that is now online. So I direct you towards the Scottish Archaeological Internet reports, which the Society of Antiquaries have on their website, to go and see the results of this, because in fact it is a fantastic piece of excavation work. And of course the main thing that it was dealing with was sort of rural depopulation and clearance, if you want to say it. I mean, vast numbers of ruined structures, farmsteads like this, litter the Scottish countryside. And it's only really in the last 20 years that we've started to treat these in an archaeological way and be able to undertake excavations and understand through mapping and detailed field work how what we see in the landscape, how that was manifested and how it came about. Obviously, the decline in population, there's a whole range of different resources for understanding that, but it's quite clear here from the population survey of Kenmore Parish. And it shows quite nicely that, you know, the drift towards the towns, partly by clearance, partly by forced clearance, partly by people finding it very difficult to make ends meet, to meet their rents, and poor harvests and all that side of things. So there's a whole series of stories and narratives that we need to engage with in terms of the historic landscape and understanding how that goes about. More recently, in terms of the 18th, 19th century material, if you're an Outlander fan, you can't avoid the Jacobites at the moment. They seem to be everywhere. And there was the big exhibition in the National Museums last year, if anybody went to see it, about the Jacobite, Bonnie Prince Charlie's Jacobite risings. Of course, the Trust has quite a number of different properties in its care: Killiecrankie and Dunkeld, Glencoe, the Battle of Glen Shiel, the Glenfinnan Monument and Culloden, to name just the ones that are sort of generally related to battlefields. And this year we'll be doing some further excavation work in Glencoe. And this is really largely as a result of the Ben Lawes project, which was identified a number of turf buildings that dated to the 17th, 18th century. And when we were out in Glencoe recently, we surveyed in a set of settlements that in fact looked like they belonged to the ones that were shown on Roy's map and may date back slightly earlier, maybe possibly even to 1692 and the massacre in Glencoe in the Jacobite period. This is the outline of the building. I don't know whether you can see it. It's not particularly good archaeology for displaying to the public. It's pretty low profile, but you can see it's marked out with yellow flags here. I have to say the yellow flags weren't there before we went, so it was even more difficult to see. We were able to spot it without the yellow flags. And we've done survey work of it now, and we intend to do bits of excavation this year. And we do thistle camps, so students and volunteers we make a lot of use of and come out and help us with our excavation work. And then hopefully the results, because many of the places that we work on end up attracting quite a lot of publicity. And from the Trust's point of view, as a membership organisation, 370,000 members contributing to our conservation work, that's very important from our understanding. And of course, it's tying the archaeology into very often the popular stories and narratives that people understand as being key to Scotland's past, of course, its recent past. And then finally, I just put this up because Culloden, the Jacobite thing there, we've been recently undertaking bits of research work with Glasgow University and the Centre for Battlefield Archaeology. Obviously, a lot of work done there. Brilliant battlefield visitor centre if you've not been. And we've just undertaken LiDAR survey of the entire battlefield. I'm about to start examining that in a bit more detail. So the Trust's portfolio really has a wide range of archaeological sites that relate to the last 200, 300 years. And we could go on at length about all the different types of sites we go. But what I'd like to do now is ask Daniel Rhodes, who's my colleague who looks after much of the east of Scotland, to come up and tell us about some of the projects that we've been doing more recently that relate to the post-medieval and early modern period in Scotland.
Thank you very much. So if any of you don't know, that's Edinburgh. Don't know, I'm in Glasgow. I live in Edinburgh, so it took me a while to find the place. First place we're going to go to then is a place called Gladstone's Land, and this is right at the top of the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, just below the castle. And it was originally built in the mid-16th century, we think, and it's actually one of the oldest places, one of the first things the National Trust for Scotland took into its portfolio in 1934. And the reason the Trust was interested in it was because of these two arches at the front. And that's actually the final remains of a colonnade that ran the full length of the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, and that's all that survives. So it's quite an important site in its own right. We were lucky enough a couple of years ago to work with Adamant Archaeology to start pulling apart this building, throwing our archaeological techniques at it, looking at the history of the structure and how it developed over time. What came out of that were three kind of main things. And one of them was actually the change in approaches to conservation over time and the way that the National Trust for Scotland has changed the things that it did to this building. It took an incredibly heavy hand in this when it first started to look after the place. And you can see, first thing it did was start to knock down some walls. It took an entire floor off the top of the building. But what it did do was discover these really important painted ceilings. It's one of only 4 that survived from the 1700s. So one of the most important things was actually being able to use archaeology to reverse engineer the conservation practice as well in Scotland since the 1930s. For example, with these ceilings, when they were first uncovered, the first thing they did to make them last longer is take them down, move them somewhere else, clean them all down with soapy water and cover them in wax. 10 years later, we took them down again, took all of that wax off and put them back because it was a dreadful idea. But it was that learning curve through conservation. The ceilings themselves, actually, they've got all of this religious iconography within them. There's grapes, which represent, here we go, what are grapes?
Wine.
It's the blood of Christ. There you go, thank you. Apples are the fall, and actually the fall, I don't mean Marquis Smith, God bless his soul. Any of you old enough for that? And the lily, which is purity, which reminds me of you. Thank you. What we were also able to do, as I say, put big cross-sections through this and think about the physical development of this building. And it's quite interesting, because when you compare the physical evidence with all the written evidence from a lot of the sort of council records and things in Edinburgh, what you start to see is this, what they call frontage creep over years, and you get this in a lot of the kind of towns and larger towns in Scotland. You have a timber frontage on the front of your building. These were promoted in the 1700s in order to try and stimulate timber trade. It's decided that they're actually unsafe, so the council then put a remit on everybody that the owners of these buildings have to build their frontages in stone, so they creep out a little bit further. Population density gets so much, so they creep out a little bit further. And actually, over a period of 200 years, you see these buildings moving further and further and narrowing all those streets. So again, it's quite interesting from a sort of population record as well, just how many people were living in these places. So that's quite a sort of nuts and bolts of what we do, is looking at these buildings, pulling them apart in that way. Next up, we're going to stick near Edinburgh, and this is a place called Inveresk in Musselburgh, and it's a building called Inveresk Lodge. Fairly innocuous little building. Inveresk itself started out sort of 1600s as this classic kind of, by 82, it's this ribbon development. By the 17 and 1800s, it's this really fancy place where people from Edinburgh have weekend homes and where they go out, and it's referred to as a kind of Riviera of Scotland because it's got such beautiful views over the sea and back over to Arthur's Seat into Edinburgh. And we were focusing, there was a fire at Inveresk Lodge. This isn't a visitor place, this is just somewhere that the trust rents out. There was a fire a few years ago, and again, that gave us the opportunity to start pulling apart this building and thinking about its development. So that small building has got a number of interesting things in its fabric. One of the interesting elements that came out was this decorative bathroom and bedroom suite. It's been thought for years and years and years this was a Macintosh suite. It actually turns out it's not. It was decorated and fitted by a boat builder from Musselburgh. So again, the trust was very proud of its Macintosh toilet. It's not a Macintosh toilet, and it was the archaeologists that told them that. This tiny little building actually had 15 different phases of development. And again, thinking about your techniques of archaeology, historical archaeology, you've got your written record, you've got your physical material record. One of the things we used in order to identify a phase of this building's development, we had an old black and white photograph. And in that photograph, there was a car parked in front of the building. We were able to read the number plate from that car and then date the photograph and date that particular wing of the building. So again, not classic archaeological evidence, but classic historical archaeology evidence. We were able to start to build up a biography of this building. We were touching on this issue of how these places have got their own inbuilt biography and story. And for a minute, we're just going to concentrate on this chap, James Wedderburn. He's a really interesting character. He is the brother, he's the son of John Wedderburn, who was captured at the Battle of Culloden. He was transported down to England and held for trial. When James went down to England to visit his father was found guilty and he was hung, drawn and quartered in front of his son. In order to keep the family safe, James and his older brother legged it to Jamaica, and they were one of the largest slave plantation owners in Jamaica for the next 60 years and made an absolute fortune. While James was there, he claimed to be a doctor, and he carried out surgery and medical procedures on all of these slaves, hundreds and hundreds of slaves over the years in Jamaica. And he also became the father of quite a few illegitimate children by his slaves. One of these children was a chap called Robert Wedderburn. Now, Robert's mum fell pregnant to James, and James saw a bit of a chance here and sold Robert's mum as a 2-for-1 deal to a friend of his, so he could deny responsibility of that child, and his child could get 2 slaves for the price of one, his friend. When Robert was of age, he joined the British Navy, and he worked his passage to London. When he was in London, he made his way up to Scotland because his family, or his mum and his aunt, had told him stories about this father of his, James. And the story goes that he arrived at Inveresk Lodge, knocked on the door, and was summarily kicked down the street by James's youngest son and a servant, and was denied access to this house and to this family. Now, thinking on what you were just saying, you've got a number of elements there. If you pull all of that archaeological theory out of the back of your head, you've got your world systems theory, you've got your triangular trade and all your slavery and all those things within this story. Cheers. No chance. And you've also got the house itself, the house biography. You know, I was thinking for cult, for coup, for car. I'm never sure. You know, and you start thinking about these buildings, these machines, and he was denied access to this machine. So you've got this architecture of access and things like that. Had a profound impact on him. He became one of the biggest anti-slavery campaigners in London. The London police shadowed him for the rest of his life, and he died. He was imprisoned at least twice that we know of for sedition, and he died a pauper. And he's got some great pamphlets out, and one of my favourite quotes, when he's campaigning against slavery and he's looking for equal rights in society, he's quoted in one of his pamphlets, "They tell us to be quiet like that bloody spoony Jesus Christ, who, like a bloody fool, tells us when we get a slap on one side of the face, turn gently round and ask them to smack the other. But like jolly old Peter, give me a rusty sword, for they've declared war against the people." He's a dude. And that all came about from looking at a small building on the outskirts of Edinburgh. Right, we're going to quickly go to Stafford. A lot of you might have heard Stuart Jeffrey from Glasgow School of Art. I think he came in and talked to the university as well. So we've been working with him on Stafford. And this came about because myself and Derek were starting to think, well, actually, the National Trust for Scotland, you know, these kind of rural places that we work and we go, big part of our job is promoting people going and visiting these places. But as archaeologists, we started to think, what record do these visitors leave behind? What is the archaeology of tourism in some of these places? So this is Stafford. It's most famous for Fingal's Cave. It's a painting by Turner. It's had a huge amount of really exciting visitors over the years. We've got the King of Saxony, Wordsworth, Turner, Mendelssohn's the most favourite. Who's that? Someone called Victoria. Jules Verne. So it's an important place. And some of the things that people have talked about, one of the things that always comes out when visitors say it's the noise of that cave. It's not necessarily the visual aspect of it, it's the noise and the way it hits your senses when you're in there. Tuneful cave, rolling of perpetual thunder, vast Aeolian harp. So, most famous is Felix Mendelssohn. Who visited it and he wrote that.
It was meant to be on the computer, but we didn't manage.
I know. IT problems. So, with Glasgow School of Art, we started to think, okay, what is it about the morphology of this place which is so striking and so exciting for people? You know, how does it hit your senses? So, being the Glasgow School of Art, they said, we've got machines that go beep, let's take them and try them out. So, right, okay. The big laser scan of it, which gave us a lovely fly through. And then what we also started doing was doing these sound sweeps. So we were recording the acoustics within this cave so that we could take it away, go to the lab, and start applying different noise sources to these acoustics and just seeing what's distinct and what's special about them. But then physically, what's the remains that all of these tourists are leaving over the years? And we started to notice some of this graffiti in the cave as well. I'm wondering about what are the relationship between people and coming and physically marking these places. If you're impressed by it, why on earth would you chisel your name into it? But that's it's a contemporary issue as well, isn't it, with graffiti? So using RTI as well, we've been recording some of those places. And again, you can just see the conditions working in. So this is a nice day, an hour later, nobody's going into that cave. And some of the things that we're starting to find, HMS Elector, we're seeing there's a relationship between the Navy and this cave. It was one of the mustering points for the Arctic convoy in the Second World War. So we see these Navy ships coming in and people are starting to, a lot of locals sort of signing in their name, what their ship is, and then off they're going in the Arctic convoy. And we've seen repeat visits over the years as well. We've got the Quentin Roosevelt, we've got Nimrod. And then excitingly, we've seen individuals as well who are associated with this place as tourists. And this looks a little bit like David Hume. This is quite an exciting consideration that we might have a signature of him on the rocks. And then, finishing up, we're going to go to New Hales, which again is just outside Edinburgh. New Hales House, that was built in the early part of the 1700s by an architect who I want to call James Brown, but I think that's the #1 soul brother, so it might not be James Brown. What I do know is that he's reported to have 34 children. He managed to live here for 4 years before going bust. He had 34 kids. Of course he went bust. Dalrymple family bought it, and what you see, we're talking about landscapes, but this time we're talking about designed landscapes. We're talking about people taking their environment and intentionally altering it to a specific artistic end. So I'll fly through really quickly. 2 examples from this estate is this shell house. Now this shell house, these are common features all over these kind of posh designed gardens and landscapes in Scotland and England in the 1700s. This one is designed to look like a volcano, designed to look like what they call a nymphaeum. So in Greek and Roman places of worship, where you would go into these caves by the sea and you would worship the sea gods. All of this material here is all actually made of industrial waste. So it's shiny slag, it's got semi-precious stones stuck into it. And what we found when we excavated is it's not just that building. There's a waterfall in front of it as well. And then we looked a little bit further. We've got reconstruction here. And we found, that's a different building. What we actually found in there was that the walls of this building are completely hollow. There's a furnace at the back of it. And there's little vents. So what happens is, you've been to the big house, to the posh house to have dinner, and you go promenading around the estate. A bunch of servants run ahead of you. And when you get to this point, you can sit down at the pool and you can see the water carefully trickling. And then you can see light and fire sparkling in all of these semi-precious stones and all of this industrial waste. And then slowly smoke begins to rise out of the very walls of the building. And oh, Tarquin, this is amazing! But what's most important, okay, it's a fancy artistic representation, but how many local artisans, how many staff does it take to run this thing? You've got half a dozen people enjoying it a year as they're visiting and having dinner with the family in the house, but actually there's a huge amount of human effort going into making these features work even after they've been built. Same again with this feature, it's a tea house, and again, it's a crumbling old building, we didn't think much of it. We got a bunch of volunteers in, and we started clearing out all of this mess in front, and we started to be able to identify individual stones from this building and do a sort of virtual reconstruction. And what we actually found was, this is one of the most important bits of neoclassical architecture in Scotland. It's a Palladian arch. There are a couple of these down in England, and thousands of people a year go and visit these things, and we've got like a little mini version of it. No one knows it's there, but again, it took archaeology, it took volunteers, and it took just a bit of thinking about what the actual material of this place was to put it together. And finally, this is a project that a student, a graduate from Edinburgh, came and worked with us for a year. Again, quite an innocuous little artefact. We got in touch with all the gardeners in National Trust for Scotland and said, you lot are digging up clay pipes all the time, bits of clay pipes, fragments and everything, and we know you stick them in a box on your windowsill and never do anything with them. Can you send them through so we can take a look at them? We've had nearly 500 bits of clay pipe arrive in the post from all over Scotland. So Emily was a volunteer. Put them all in order, worked out the provenance and the date for all of them, and lo and behold, we've got a national collection and a social history of clay pipe production in Scotland, totally by accident, from all of these disparate places all over the country, and just by calling in this single type of artefacts. So again, we accidentally have collections. We've got these large landscape places, we've got these large buildings with really important social and archaeological meaning behind them. And we've got opportunity to look at collections like this as well and think about the social implications of these too. So, I'll stop. Thank you.